Have you ever thought about how one single decision, one law, could have consequences so massive that it leads to war? Well, today we're jumping into the middle of the French Revolution to look at exactly that. A law that was meant to fix a problem, but instead it lit a fuse that blew the country apart. It sounds a little crazy, doesn't it? How can a single piece of legislation cause that much chaos? But that's what makes this story so fascinating. We're going to unpack how a law aimed at the Catholic Church ended up causing a brutal civil war. Let's get into it. All right, so to really get what's going on, we have to wind the clock back to 1789. France is in the middle of a revolution, sure, but it's also on the brink of total collapse. The new revolutionary government was absolutely desperate for a way to fix things. The biggest problem, by far, was money. The old government had spent way too much on wars and on the king's extravagant lifestyle. I mean, the country was completely buried in debt. So the revolutionaries started hunting for cash, and their eyes landed on one of the wealthiest institutions in the entire country. You're seeing that right. The Catholic Church owned a staggering 10% of all the land in France. To the cash-strapped revolutionaries, this looked like a golden opportunity. So they decided to seize all of the church's property and use it to pay off the national debt. But here's the catch. If you take the church's land, you also have to take on its jobs, like paying priests and running churches. And that led them to a really radical idea, a law they called the Civil Constitution of the Clergy. This wasn't just a small change. This was the government's attempt to completely rebuild the relationship between church and state from the ground up. Okay, so before we go any further, let's make sure we're on the same page with the word clergy. Basically, we're talking about the professional leaders of the church, the priests who run the local parishes and the bishops who manage them. This new law was aimed squarely at them. So what did this law actually do? Well, first, it turned every priest and bishop into a government employee with a government salary. Second, it completely redrew the church map, throwing out old districts to match the new political ones. And third, and this was a huge deal, it declared that priests and bishops would now be elected by the people. Yep, ordinary citizens, even those who weren't Catholic, could now vote for their religious leaders. Now, the government had this brand new system, but they had a big problem. They had to make sure the clergy would actually go along with it. And that led to a showdown, a moment that forced every single priest in France to pick a side. I mean, that was the million-dollar question, right? Would these men who had sworn their loyalty to God and the Pope now accept the government as their new boss? This was a radical change to centuries of tradition, and the revolutionaries knew they couldn't just hope for the best. They needed a guarantee. So in November of 1790, they lowered the boom. Every single member of the clergy was ordered to take a public oath swearing loyalty to the nation, the law, and the new civil constitution. And if you refused, you were out. No job, no salary, and no right to preach in your church. And just like that, the oath split the French clergy right down the middle. On one side, you had the jurying clergy, the ones who took the oath. They became known as constitutional priests. On the other side were the non-jurying priests, who refused. They stayed loyal to the Pope and were called refractory priests. This wasn't just some small disagreement. This was a fundamental break. And just look at these numbers. It was an almost perfect 50-50 split. We're talking about the parish priests here, the ones who interacted with everyday people in their villages. Half of them were now openly defying the revolutionary government. This was a massive problem. As you can probably guess, a split this deep inside the church didn't stay quiet for long. It spilled out into every town and village, turning neighbor against neighbor, and eventually it exploded into open warfare. And you can see on this timeline just how quickly everything went downhill. The law passes in July. Just 4 months later, the oath is demanded. Then, in the spring of 1791, the Pope himself gets involved. Less than 2 years after that, all-out civil war. The Pope's statement was an absolute game changer. He basically declared that this law was an attack on God. For all the French Catholics who were struggling with who to support, this was a clear signal from the very top. The Pope had just turned political resistance into a holy cause. And that message really hit home in the countryside. In a region called the Vendée, people felt that the revolution in Paris was threatening their entire way of life. So when the government tried to force out their local priests they had known their whole lives, they grabbed their weapons. This wasn't a protest anymore. This was a war to defend their faith. The fire that was started by the civil constitution of the clergy burned for nearly a decade, and it left some really deep scars on France. So, what happened to those priests who resisted? And how did this whole mess finally end?
For those refractory priests, life became incredibly dangerous. The government branded them as enemies of the state. Thousands were forced to flee the country. Others went into hiding, holding secret services in barns or deep in the woods. And if they were caught, the punishment was swift and brutal: prison or even execution. So, how did it end? Well, the conflict was finally resolved when a guy named Napoleon Bonaparte took power. Napoleon was a practical guy, and he knew that if he wanted to unite France, he had to stop this religious war. So in 1801, he made a deal with the Pope called the Concordat. It was a compromise. Catholicism was officially recognized again, but the state still had some say. It was the peace treaty the country desperately needed.
So, what's the big lesson here? It's that a law created to solve a financial crisis ended up creating a crisis of faith that tore a nation in two. It's a powerful reminder that trying to force a choice between loyalty to your country and loyalty to your beliefs can have truly explosive consequences.